What if I told you that World War II didn't really begin in 1939? What if the true beginning of the deadliest conflict in human history happened more than 20 years earlier, inside a magnificent palace filled with diplomats, politicians, and world leaders, a place where men gathered to create peace, but may have unknowingly created the conditions for an even greater war. After World War I, millions were dead. Entire cities lay in ruins. Europe was exhausted. The world desperately wanted peace. But the peace agreement signed in 1919 would leave one nation humiliated, angry, and determined to seek revenge. That nation was Germany, and the treaty was called the Treaty of Versailles. This is the story of how a document meant to end all wars may have helped create an even deadlier one. November 11, 1918. The guns finally fell silent across Europe. For more than 4 years, World War I had consumed entire nations. Over 16 million people had lost their lives. Millions more returned home wounded, traumatized, or permanently disabled. The war had devastated economies, destroyed infrastructure, and shattered families across the continent. Germany and its allies had been defeated. The German Empire collapsed. Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. A new German government emerged, hoping to negotiate a fair peace with the victorious Allies. Many Germans believed the peace would be based on the principles outlined by the American president. Wilson had proposed his famous 14 points. These principles promised a fair and lasting peace. Many Germans expected reasonable treatment. They believed the war had been lost, but they did not expect punishment. They were wrong. In January 1919, representatives from around the world gathered in the city of Paris. Their goal was simple: create a new world order and prevent another global conflict. The most influential leaders became known as the Big Three. They were of the United States, of Britain, and of France. Although they shared a common victory, they had very different goals. Wilson wanted a fair peace. He believed harsh punishment would only create future problems. Lloyd George wanted compensation but also understood that Germany remained an important economic partner. Clemenceau, however, had a different perspective. France had suffered enormously during the war. Much of the fighting had occurred on French soil. Entire towns had been destroyed. Millions of French citizens had suffered. Clemenceau wanted Germany weakened so severely that it could never threaten France again. As negotiations continued, compromise became increasingly difficult. The future of Europe hung in the balance. One of the most controversial aspects of the peace conference was Germany's exclusion. German representatives were not allowed to participate in the negotiations. Instead, the Allied powers drafted the treaty themselves. When the Germans finally saw the document, they were shocked. Many believed the terms were far harsher than expected. German officials protested. They argued that the treaty violated the principles of fairness they had been promised. But the Allies refused major changes. Germany was given an ultimatum: sign the treaty or face renewed military action. With little choice, Germany accepted. On June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the treaty was signed inside the Palace of Versailles. For many Germans, the signing was not a peace agreement. It was a national humiliation. Perhaps the most controversial section of the treaty was Article 231. Often called the War Guilt Clause. This article stated that Germany and its allies were responsible for causing the war. To many Germans, this accusation was deeply offensive. They believed responsibility for the war was shared among multiple nations. Yet the treaty placed the blame squarely on Germany. The clause had important consequences. Because Germany accepted responsibility, it could also be forced to pay reparations. These payments were intended to compensate the Allies for war damages. But the psychological impact was even greater. Millions of Germans felt dishonored. They viewed the clause as an attack on national pride. The resentment created by Article 231 would linger for decades. The treaty demanded enormous reparations from Germany. The exact amount would later be set at billions of dollars. Germany's economy was already struggling after years of war. Now it faced crushing financial obligations. To make matters worse, Germany lost important industrial territories and valuable natural resources. Factories closed. Businesses struggled. Unemployment increased. The situation became even worse during the early 1920s. Germany experienced one of the most severe cases of hyperinflation in modern history. Money became nearly worthless. Workers were paid with wheelbarrows full of banknotes. Families saw their life savings disappear. Many ordinary Germans blamed the Treaty of Versailles for their suffering. Whether that blame was entirely justified remains debated by historians. But politically, perception mattered more than reality. And the perception was clear. Millions believed the treaty had ruined their country. Germany also lost significant territory. Large areas were transferred to neighboring countries. The region of Alsace-Lorraine returned to France. Poland received territory that gave it access to the sea. Several regions were placed under international administration. Germany lost all of its overseas colonies. These territories were distributed among the victorious powers. To many Germans, these losses felt like a national dismemberment. Families suddenly found themselves living outside German borders. Economic resources disappeared. National pride suffered another blow. The map of Europe had changed dramatically. But many Germans hoped one day those changes could be reversed. The treaty imposed strict military limitations. Germany's army was reduced to just 100,000 soldiers. Conscription was banned. Tanks were prohibited. Military aircraft were forbidden. Submarines were not allowed. The German navy was drastically reduced. The Rhineland was demilitarized. For France, these measures provided security. For Germany, they represented humiliation. Many former soldiers felt betrayed. Nationalists argued that Germany had been stripped of its ability to defend itself. These feelings created fertile ground for radical political movements. Groups promising to restore German strength began gaining support. The years after World War I were chaotic. Germany's new democratic government, known as the Weimar Republic, faced enormous challenges. Political violence became common. Communists and right-wing extremists fought for influence. Assassinations and attempted coups shook the nation. Many citizens blamed democratic politicians for accepting the Treaty of Versailles. A dangerous myth began spreading. Known as the "stab in the back" legend, it claimed Germany's army had not truly been defeated. Instead, politicians and traitors had supposedly betrayed the nation. The myth was false. But it became extremely powerful. And it would later be exploited by ambitious political leaders. The years after World War I were chaotic. Germany's new democratic government, known as the Weimar Republic, faced enormous challenges. Political violence became common. Communists and right-wing extremists fought for influence. Assassinations and attempted coups shook the nation. Many citizens blamed democratic politicians for accepting the Treaty of Versailles. A dangerous myth began spreading. Known as the "stab in the back" legend, it claimed Germany's army had not truly been defeated. Instead, Politicians and traitors had supposedly betrayed the nation. The myth was false. But it became extremely powerful. And it would later be exploited by ambitious political leaders. Among those who despised the Treaty of Versailles was a former soldier named Hitler. Repeatedly attacked the treaty in speeches. He described it as a disgrace. He promised to overturn its provisions. He promised to rebuild Germany's military. He promised to restore lost territory. Most importantly, he promised to make Germany powerful again. These messages resonated with millions of frustrated citizens, especially during the economic hardships of the 1920s and the Great Depression of the 1930s. As support for extremist movements grew, Hitler's influence expanded. In 1933, he became Chancellor of Germany. The world was about to witness the consequences. Once in power, Hitler moved quickly. He rebuilt Germany's armed forces. He remilitarized the Rhineland. He annexed Austria. He demanded territory from neighboring countries. Each step directly challenged the Treaty of Versailles. The Allies protested but often failed to act decisively. Hitler interpreted their hesitation as weakness. By 1939, Europe stood on the edge of another catastrophe. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. World War II had begun. The peace treaty designed to prevent future conflict had failed. The Treaty of Versailles remains one of history's most controversial agreements. Some historians argue it was too harsh. Others believe it was not enforced strongly enough. The debate continues even today. But one fact is undeniable. The treaty shaped the political, economic, and psychological landscape of post-war Germany. It created grievances that extremists would later exploit. It fueled anger, resentment, and nationalism. And it became one of the key factors that contributed to the rise of Adolf Hitler and the outbreak of World War II. The leaders who signed the treaty believed they were securing peace. Instead, they may have been writing the opening chapter of another global war. And that is why the story of the Treaty of Versailles is not just about the end of World War I.